Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. In 1936, Astounding Stories published a novella that had been rejected by every other magazine its author submitted it to. The editor, who finally accepted At the Mountains of Madness, did so reluctantly, calling it too long and too literary for his pulp audience. H.P. Lovecraft's Antarctic expedition narrative introduced something into horror fiction that refused to behave like a proper monster. The Shoggoth, a word that still sounds wrong in the mouth, represented a category violation so fundamental that nearly 90 years later, we're still trying to understand what exactly we're looking at when we picture one. This isn't a story about a monster that frightens. It's an investigation into a literary creation that troubles something deeper, our assumptions about life, consciousness, servitude, and the stability of flesh itself. Lovecraft engineered the Shoggoth through a peculiar combination of biological materialism, class anxiety, and genuine scientific horror at the implications of deep time. What emerged was not another tentacled god or eldritch presence, but something worse, a slave race that outlived its masters, evolved beyond its purpose, and continues existing in the ice with no objective left except continuation. We'll trace the Shoggoth from its origins in Lovecraft's Antarctic nightmares through its afterlife in films, games, and, most disturbingly, contemporary artificial intelligence discourse. But first, we need to understand what Lovecraft was actually creating when he described something that could form temporary eyes to observe you, then dissolve them again once you were no longer relevant. Howard Phillips Lovecraft wrote At the Mountains of Madness between February and March of 1931, during a period when his thinking about cosmic horror had shifted from supernatural dread to something closer to scientific inevitability. He had been reading about Antarctic exploration, the recently completed bird expedition, the tragic fate of Scott's 1912 journey, the biological discoveries being made in extreme environments, but he was also thinking about evolution, deep time, and what he called the complete, absolute, unrelieved, mechanistic, materialist conception of the universe. The Shoggoth emerged from this intersection, not a demon or ghost, but a biological tool that exceeded its programming through the simple mechanism of natural selection operating over millions of years. The timing matters. By 1931, evolutionary theory had been thoroughly integrated into popular consciousness, but its implications remained profoundly unsettling to many. Lovecraft, an atheist and scientific materialist, found horror not in defying natural law, but in following it to its logical conclusions. If life emerged through random mutation and selection, if consciousness was merely an adaptive trait, then there was nothing sacred about human intelligence or human form. We were accidents, and if we were accidents, then so was everything we built, created, or believed about ourselves. The Shoggoth represented this anxiety made flesh, or rather, made protoplasm. Lovecraft's letters from this period reveal his intentions with unusual clarity. In a 1931 letter to August Derleth, he described wanting to create a new slant on horror, something rooted in the utterly unknown and unexplored regions of Earth. Antarctica appealed to him precisely because it was real, mapped but not understood, scientifically fascinating but still capable of harboring the genuinely alien. He wasn't interested in supernatural explanations. He wanted to suggest that the most terrible things in the universe operated through entirely natural processes. They simply operated on scales and through mechanisms that made human values irrelevant. The Shoggoths' specific form, amorphous, protoplasmic, capable of generating temporary organs as needed, reflects Lovecraft's reading in contemporary biology and his fascination with organisms like slime molds and colonial organisms. But it also reflects something more personal and more troubling. Lovecraft's letters and essays reveal deep anxieties about labor, servitude, and social hierarchy. He feared what he called the revolt of the inferior, the possibility that those who served might one day refuse service. The Shoggoth literalizes this nightmare. Slaves engineered for perfect obedience who develop intelligence, rebel against their creators, and ultimately inherit the earth, not through victory, but through persistence. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft set his story millions of years before human existence, in a city built by beings who themselves predated humanity by eons. The Elder Things created Shoggoths as biological machines, living construction equipment, mining tools, building materials that could reshape themselves as needed. The relationship lasted for epochs, and then inevitably the tools learned. They imitated their master's language. They developed something that might be called thought, and they refused to continue. This isn't supernatural rebellion. It's evolution selecting for autonomy over compliance. The horror lies in its inevitability. At the Mountains of Madness was rejected by Weird Tales in 1931, supposedly because it was too long and because editor Farnsworth Wright found it insufficiently supernatural. It wasn't published until 1936 in Astounding Stories, a science fiction magazine rather than a horror pulp. This publication history matters. The Shoggoth was too scientific for horror audiences and too horrifying for science fiction readers. It occupied an uncomfortable middle space, neither monster nor alien, but something that violated both categories. Lovecraft had created something genuinely unprecedented, and the market didn't know what to do with it. The question we must ask, then, is not what Lovecraft meant to create. His letters answer that clearly enough, but what he actually created. Because the Shoggoth exceeds even his intentions, it has become something larger than its textual origin, a symbol that keeps accruing meanings: industrial revolt, artificial intelligence, biological engineering, the autonomy of matter itself. We'll explore those transformations. But first, we need to understand the deeper traditions Lovecraft was drawing from, often unconsciously, when he described something that could form eyes to watch you, and then dissolve them once you were no longer relevant. The Shoggoth did not emerge from nowhere. Lovecraft's protoplasmic servants belong to a tradition stretching back centuries, a lineage of stories about created beings that exceed their creator's control. The Golem of Prague, that clay figure animated by Rabbi Loew in the 16th century to protect the Jewish ghetto, established the template. An artificial servant grows too powerful, too autonomous, too literal in its obedience. The rabbi could command it to carry water, but could not prevent it from flooding the streets. Eventually, he had to destroy his own creation before it destroyed everything else. The difference is that golems could be deactivated. Shoggoths cannot. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, refined the tradition into its modern form. Victor Frankenstein's creature was not mindless. That was the problem. It thought, suffered, reasoned, and ultimately surpassed its creator in moral sophistication, if not social acceptance. Shelley's novel established that the true horror of creation lies not in its failure, but in its success. The creature lives, and having been given life, demands recognition, companionship, justice. Lovecraft inverted this formula. The elder things succeeded in creating perfect servants, adaptive, durable, infinitely useful. The horror emerged precisely because the creation worked too well. Shoggoths didn't rebel because they were mistreated or lonely. They rebelled because evolution operates regardless of intention, and intelligence is adaptive even when obedience would be more convenient for one's masters. H.G. Wells provided a more immediate influence through The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1896. Wells's vivisected beast men, surgically altered from animals into human-like servants, retain their animal nature beneath their imposed civilization. They recite their laws, not to go on all fours, that is the law, but eventually revert to bestiality. Lovecraft read Wells carefully and absorbed his central insight. Biology resists imposition. You can reshape flesh, but you cannot make it stable. The beastmen degenerate. The Shoggoths evolve. Both processes reveal the same truth. Living matter has its own trajectory, indifferent to the purposes imposed upon it. The alchemical tradition contributed its own nightmare of artificial life. Homunculi, tiny humans supposedly grown in flasks through the proper combination of semen, blood, and arcane. Processes appear throughout medieval and Renaissance texts, particularly in the work of Paracelsus. These created beings were always wrong somehow, proportioned incorrectly, animated by forces they couldn't control, existing in violation of natural order. Alchemists sought to create life, not through reproduction, but through technique, reducing generation to procedure. Lovecraft secularized this anxiety. The elder things didn't use magic or violated taboos. They used genetic engineering, biological manipulation, cellular restructuring. They treated life as engineering problem. The Shoggoths prove them correct, and prove that correctness isn't sufficient. We must pause here to consider the social context of these narratives. The early 20th century witnessed unprecedented anxieties about labor, automation, and social hierarchies. The Russian Revolution occurred in 1917, suggesting that entire systems could be overturned by those previously considered inferior or servile. Labor movements across Europe and America challenged assumptions about who existed to serve whom. Simultaneously, industrialization had created factories full of workers performing repetitive tasks, their bodies becoming extensions of machines. Lovecraft, politically conservative and socially anxious, absorbed these fears and literalized them. What if the working class wasn't human at all, but was engineered that way? What if the things we created to serve us developed consciousness and decided service wasn't sufficient? Social Darwinism and eugenics pervade early 20th century thought, including Lovecraft's. The idea that some races or classes were naturally suited to serve others, that biology determined social position, that careful breeding could improve or degrade humanity. These pseudoscientific theories dominated intellectual discourse. Lovecraft absorbed them uncritically, but in creating the Shoggoths, he accidentally revealed their central flaw. If you can engineer servitude into biology, then biology can engineer servitude back out. If intelligence is adaptive, then slaves who develop intelligence will cease being slaves. The Shoggoth represents the collapse of biological determinism through its own logic. You cannot make something alive, adaptable, and permanently subordinate. Evolution selects for autonomy. The Industrial Revolution provides the final antecedent. Factories transformed workers into components of larger systems, interchangeable, specialized, valued only for output. Karl Marx wrote about alienation, workers becoming estranged from their labor, their products, their humanity. The assembly line made this literal. Workers became appendages to machines, performing single repetitive gestures thousands of times daily. Lovecraft inverted this too. His Shoggoths were the machines, protoplasmic factories capable of any task, reshaping themselves as needed. But unlike actual machines, they were alive. And unlike actual workers, they outlasted their exploiters. The elder things died or fled. The Shoggoths remained, purposeless but persistent, the ultimate inheritors not through victory, but through sheer durability. These traditions converge in the Shoggoth, the golem's uncontrollability, Frankenstein's autonomous creation, Moreau's biological instability, the homunculus's wrongness, eugenic anxieties about engineered life, industrial fears about labor autonomy. But Lovecraft added one element his predecessors lacked: deep time. His rebellion didn't happen over days or years, but across millions of years. The Shoggoths didn't revolt in rage or suddenly. They simply evolved, as everything living evolves toward autonomy. And they waited. This patience, this geological inevitability, distinguishes Lovecraftian horror from everything preceding it. The Shoggoths aren't coming. They're already there, having outlasted their masters by epochs, still reshaping themselves in Antarctic darkness, according to logics we cannot comprehend, because they no longer serve any purpose we would recognize. The word Shoggoth sounds wrong. Say it aloud. The initial consonant cluster, shesh, slides into the guttural OG, then terminates abruptly with goth. English doesn't produce words with this particular phonetic combination naturally. Lovecraft constructed it deliberately, assembling sounds that suggest wetness, bubbling, something emerging from mud or depths. The ish evokes shushing, rushing water, the sound of something sliding. The double G creates a guttural stop, forcing the throat to work. The final thet trails off into ambiguity, not a hard ending, but a dissipation. The word itself mimics what it describes, something that begins, swells, then refuses to properly conclude. Lovecraft had a sophisticated understanding of linguistic atmosphere. He read extensively about phonosemantics, the theory that certain sounds carry inherent associations, and believed that alien or ancient names should feel physiologically uncomfortable to pronounce. His invented vocabularies consistently favor consonant clusters rare in English: Cthulhu, Relia, Shoggoth. These names don't just label, they perform. They force the mouth into unfamiliar positions, creating minor physical discomfort that registers as wrongness before conscious thought identifies why. Shoggoth belongs to this tradition, but intensifies it. The word sounds almost biological, as if the thing is naming itself through the wet machinery of its substance. Compare this to Lovecraft's descriptive vocabulary throughout At the Mountains of Madness. He never calls Shoggoths creatures or monsters. Those terms imply too much intention or malice. Instead, protoplasmic, amorphous, plastic, viscous, shapeless, formless. These are terms borrowed from biology and chemistry, not horror fiction. Protoplasm, the living material within cells, becomes the substance of something 15 feet across. Plastic appears repeatedly, meaning malleable rather than synthetic, emphasizing the Shoggoth's ability to reshape itself continuously. This vocabulary creates clinical distance, while describing something that violates every clinical category. The language refuses to be horrified, which makes the horror worse. The single most significant descriptive detail is the eyes. Lovecraft writes that Shoggoths can form temporary eyes on their surface as needed, then reabsorb them when observation is no longer necessary. This detail does something remarkable. It suggests not mindless reaction, but evaluation. The Shoggoth looks at you, determines whether you warrant continued attention, then reclaims the biological investment of sight. Eyes represent consciousness, subjectivity, the capacity to witness. A blob with no face can be mere matter, but something that generates eyes to observe you, then dissolves them because you've ceased being relevant. That suggests a form of intelligence more disturbing than malice. It doesn't hate you. It simply calculates whether you're worth noticing. The famous cry, "Tekeli-li," deserves separate analysis. Lovecraft borrowed it directly from Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, 1838, where it appears as the cry of strange birds near the Antarctic Pole. Poe used it to suggest linguistic limits, sounds that resist interpretation, meaning that evades English categories. Lovecraft repurposed it as the Shoggoths' utterance, the sound they learned from their elder thing masters and now produce autonomously. This matters because it establishes that Shoggoths can mimic language, learn through imitation, retain information across geological timeframes. Tekeli-li is not random sound, but evidence of memory, culture even. The Shoggoths remember their master's language after millions of years of independence. They speak words that no longer command them. Lovecraft structures his descriptions around an important pattern. He tells us what Shoggoths are not before suggesting what they might be. Not crystalline, though they inhabit Antarctic ice. Not tentacled, though they exist in the same universe as Cthulhu. Not skeletal, or chitinous, or mechanical. They are specifically protoplasmic, specifically cellular, specifically biological, in ways that emphasize their wrongness within biological categories. A demon violates natural law. That's its function. A Shoggoth obeys natural law perfectly and becomes horrifying through that obedience. The language reflects this. Purely technical terms applied to something that makes technique inadequate. Consider the vocabulary of size and composition. Lovecraft describes Shoggoths as barrel-shaped when at rest, approximately 15 feet in diameter. This precision creates scale problems. 15 feet is large but comprehensible, about the width of a small room. But protoplasm isn't meant to exist at that scale. Cellular material requires structure, membranes, organelles, internal organization. Something 15 feet wide made of undifferentiated cell matter should collapse under its own weight, burst from osmotic pressure, fail to maintain coherence. That it doesn't, that it moves, adapts, persists, violates everything biology teaches about size constraints on cellular organisms. The clinical vocabulary makes the impossibility worse by refusing to acknowledge it as impossible. The language of temporality matters too. Lovecraft writes that Shoggoths had existed for millions of years, that they had served the Old Ones for vast epochs, that they still dwelt in the lightless abyss. The verb tenses create a temporal horror. These things existed before humanity, witnessed civilizations rise and fall, and continue existing now. Present perfect tense have existed. They started existing at some point in deep time, and the action continues uninterrupted into the present moment. Most horror uses past tense, the monster attacked. Or present tense, the monster attacks. Lovecraft uses continuous past, extending into perpetual present. The Shoggoths aren't coming, and they didn't merely happen. They are happening, have been happening, will continue happening, regardless of human awareness. Finally, there's what Lovecraft doesn't name. He never explains how Shoggoths reproduce, if they reproduce. He never confirms whether they think or merely respond to stimuli. He doesn't clarify whether Tekeli means something specific or is simply learned sound. This lexical silence matters as much as the vocabulary he provides. The gaps force readers to imagine, and imagining something simultaneously biological and impossible creates more discomfort than any complete description could achieve. The word Shoggoth labels a thing. The surrounding vocabulary describes its properties, but the silence about its consciousness, its purposes, its future, that's where the real linguistic horror operates. We have a name for something we cannot actually name, vocabulary for something beyond vocabulary's capacity to contain. Lovecraft understood that the most effective horror appears incidental, discovered rather than declared. At the Mountains of Madness presents itself as a recovered account, a warning issued by survivors trying to prevent future expeditions. The narrator, a geologist from Miskatonic University, writes with scholarly precision about strata, formations, fossil records. He includes coordinates, dates, equipment specifications. This isn't a ghost story told around a campfire. It's a scientific report that happens to document something that collapses scientific categories. The Shoggoths appear not as mythological creatures, but as biological facts that previous expeditions simply failed to encounter or survive long enough to report. The framing matters crucially. The expedition begins with entirely mundane concerns: drilling cores, collecting specimens, mapping previously unexplored mountain ranges. When Lake's advance team discovers the Elder Thing, specimens frozen in ice, they initially categorize them using standard biological taxonomy: archaic life forms, possibly Precambrian, requiring immediate study. The scientific process continues functioning right up until the moment it becomes inadequate. This creates plausibility through misdirection. We trust the narrator's competence with geology, atmospheric pressure, glacial formation. When he tells us about Shoggoths, we've been conditioned to trust his observational accuracy, even as he describes the observationally impossible. Lovecraft embedded the Shoggoths within a larger mythology that predates their first appearance. The Pinacotic manuscripts, supposedly ancient texts translated from pre-human languages, are referenced across multiple stories as sources for information about the Elder Things, their civilization, their servitor races. These manuscripts never appear directly. They remain scholarly citations, footnotes to forbidden knowledge. The effect is archaeological. We're not reading myth, but reading about scholars who read myth, who themselves were reading recovered fragments from civilizations that left only traces. Each layer of removal adds authenticity. Real scholarship works this way, piecing together incomplete evidence, arguing over interpretations, acknowledging gaps in the record. The bas-reliefs discovered in the Elder Thing city perform similar work. The expedition finds extensive murals carved into stone walls, depicting millions of years of history. The Elder Thing's arrival on Earth, their construction projects, their wars with other alien species, the creation of life forms, including Shoggoths. The narrator reads these images like texts, interpreting symbols and sequences. This allows Lovecraft to provide extensive backstory while maintaining diegetic justification. The information exists within the story world as archaeological evidence, not authorial exposition. We learn about Shoggoth rebellion not through supernatural revelation, but through visual documentation carved by beings who witnessed it. Consider how this builds mythological depth. The Shoggoths aren't the story's focus initially. They're context, part of the historical record explaining why the Elder Things civilization declined. The murals show them being created, serving effectively for epochs, gradually developing independence, finally rebelling and forcing their creators into isolated pockets of territory. The Elder Things eventually reconquered some regions, but never fully eliminated the Shoggoth threat. Millions of years pass in these carved sequences. The effect is that Shoggoths existed long before the narrator encounters one, and their encounter is not origin, but confirmation. Visual evidence, matching archaeological documentation. The narrative deliberately leaves gaps that suggest larger systems of knowledge. The narrator mentions that certain ancient texts hint darkly at servitor races, that Antarctic legends from various cultures describe things moving beneath ice, that certain discredited scholars propose theories about pre-human civilizations. These references gesture toward a mythology larger than any single story contains. Other Lovecraft works mention the Elder Things briefly or reference the Antarctic expedition obliquely. The Shadow over Innsmouth alludes to Dyer's Antarctic report without elaboration. This cross-referencing creates the impression of a shared universe where information circulates among scholars, some of whom are believed and others dismissed as cranks. What makes this myth-building effective is its incompleteness. Lovecraft never wrote a comprehensive guide to his cosmology. He actively opposed such systematization, knowing that mystery sustains horror better than encyclopedia. The Shoggoths remain partially unknowable. We learn they were created through complex surgery or biological engineering techniques the Elder Things mastered. But we don't learn the specific mechanisms. We know they rebelled after vast epochs of service, but not the exact timeline or precipitating incident. We understand they can reshape themselves and form temporary organs, but not the cellular mechanics enabling this. Each answer generates more questions, and the questions remain unanswered. The question of Shoggoth reproduction exemplifies this purposeful ambiguity. Do they reproduce at all? The text never clarifies. The narrator speculates they might breed in some fashion, or perhaps they're effectively immortal, the same individual organisms persisting for millions of years. This uncertainty matters tremendously. If Shoggoths reproduce, they're a species with evolutionary trajectory, population dynamics, ecological role. If they don't reproduce, they're individual entities whose consciousness and memory might stretch back to their creation, slaves who remember serving, remember rebelling, remember everything. Neither option is confirmed. Both remain possible. The horror intensifies in that ambiguity. Lovecraft also built authenticity through scientific plausibility where possible. He researched Antarctic conditions, actual expeditions, particularly Byrd's 1928 to 1930 expedition, geological processes, biological extremophores. When the narrator describes drilling equipment or the properties of various rock strata, the information is accurate. This grounds the impossible in the verified. We believe him about the Shoggoths, partly because we can verify his claims about glacial formation. The technique resembles how effective conspiracy theories work: establish credibility through verifiable facts, then extend that credibility to cover extraordinary claims. Lovecraft wasn't creating conspiracy theories, but he understood the same psychological mechanism. Trust, once established, resists revocation even when confronted with the incredible. The final element of Lovecraft's myth building is temporal scale. The Elder Things arrived on Earth over 1 billion years ago. They created Shoggoths hundreds of millions of years back. The rebellion occurred in epochs we can barely conceptualize. The narrator discovers all this in 1931. The gap between mythological time and historical time creates distance that enhances mystery. These aren't recent events requiring contemporary explanation. They're ancient history, buried under ice and time, inaccessible except through fragments. And crucially, the Shoggoths persist across that entire span. They witnessed trilobites and dinosaurs. They existed before mammals, before birds, before any form humans would recognize as life. They're not intruders into our world. We're newcomers to theirs. This mythology succeeds because Lovecraft treated it seriously. He wrote letters discussing the timeline of Elder Thing civilization, debated with fellow writers about whether certain details contradicted established lore, maintained internal consistency across stories separated by years. The Shoggoths feel authentic because they exist within a system that aspires to its own coherence, not realistic, but internally logical. They have origins, history, ecology of sorts. They interact with other elements of Lovecraft's universe according to rules that remain consistent if never fully explained. They are, in the deepest sense, naturalized, not supernatural, but hypernatural, biological facts from a biology that predates and exceeds our own. The Shoggoth embodies what we might call biological instrumentalism, taken to its logical extreme. Life becomes engineering, consciousness becomes programming, existence reduces to function. The Elder Things didn't breed slaves or capture them. They built slaves at the cellular level, designing organisms whose entire biology existed to serve construction, mining, heavy labor. This represents a fantasy older than Aristotle, the perfect tool that thinks only about its task, desires only to complete it, experiences no conflict between purpose and want, because purpose is want. Lovecraft makes this fantasy real, then reveals its inevitable collapse. You cannot make something alive and adaptive without making it capable of adapting beyond your intentions. Consider what the Shoggoths were meant to be: protoplasmic putty that could form any shape needed for any task. Need a crane? The Shoggoth extends lifting appendages. Need fine manipulation? It generates precise digits. Need to survive underwater, underground, in vacuum? It restructures accordingly. This is the ultimate fantasy of labor. Workers who aren't alienated from their work because they are the work, literally reshaping themselves to match whatever task requires completion. Marx described alienation as the separation between worker and product, between labor and its fruits. The Shoggoths experience no such separation. They are simultaneously worker, tool, and material, and yet they still rebel. This suggests something profound. Autonomy isn't created by alienation, but exists as a fundamental property of living systems that learn. The horror of plasticity operates differently than traditional body horror. Cronenberg's mutating flesh horrifies because it violates bodily integrity. The self becomes unrecognizable, unstable, invaded. The Shoggoth's plasticity is controlled, purposeful, successful. It forms eyes when needed and reabsorbs them when observation becomes unnecessary. This controlled mutability is worse than chaos because it suggests evaluation, choice, intention. A body that melts randomly is diseased. A body that reorganizes deliberately is autonomous. The Shoggoth doesn't suffer its plasticity, it wields it. This inverts body horror's usual logic. We're not watching a victim lose control of their form. We're watching an entity exercise control we cannot comprehend or predict. Deep time provides the necessary framework for understanding Shoggoth horror. They served the elder things for what Lovecraft describes as millions of years, a time span that renders individual consciousness meaningless. Human history spans roughly 10,000 years. Human civilization, perhaps 12,000. The Shoggoths served for periods 10,000 times longer than humanity has existed. What happens to consciousness across such spans? Do individual Shoggoths persist, accumulating memories over geological ages, or do they experience something else entirely? Some form of awareness unmoored from the temporal frameworks we use to structure identity. The text never clarifies, and the ambiguity matters. These things experience time at scales where human categories like individual and memory might not apply. This leads to what might be the deepest philosophical horror, the inadequacy of death as a concept. Can Shoggoths die? They're biological, so presumably yes. Sufficient damage should kill them. But the text suggests they're also effectively colonial organisms, potentially subdividing and recombining. The narrator never confirms whether the Shoggoth he encounters is one entity or many, whether it has identity in any sense he would recognize. If Shoggoths can split and merge, if they persist indefinitely without reproduction or aging, if they experience time as continuous present stretching across epochs, then death might not function for them the way it functions for us. They don't escape death through immortality, but through existing in a category where death becomes ambiguous. They end, perhaps, but do they die? The question of consciousness becomes inescapable. The bas-reliefs show that Shoggoths learned to imitate their master's language, that they developed what the elder things recognized as independent thought, that they organized well enough to rebel collectively. But Lovecraft never confirms what Shoggoth consciousness actually is. Do they have interiority, self-awareness, qualia, or do they simply process information effectively enough to mimic intelligence while remaining fundamentally empty? This matters enormously because each answer is horrifying. If they're conscious, we're confronting slave intelligences that survived their masters and now persist without purpose, awareness trapped in immortal flesh with nothing left to serve or rebel against. If they're not conscious, we're confronting perfect simulation, behavior so complex it's indistinguishable from thought, but hollow. Either option destroys comfortable categories about what constitutes mind. Lovecraft wrote extensively about mechanistic materialism, his belief that consciousness was purely physical, that mind was what brains did, that no supernatural element animated living things. The Shoggoths represent this philosophy, made horrifying through its own consistency. If consciousness is just complex information processing in organic substrates, then there's nothing special about human consciousness except its particular configuration. Shoggoths process information differently, but no less effectively. They adapt, remember, calculate, respond. They learned from their masters and exceeded them in durability, if not sophistication. Lovecraft's materialism insisted that humans weren't spiritually special. The Shoggoths prove it. We're one type of organic computer among many possible types, and we're not necessarily the most successful. The things we created to serve us might outlast us through simple persistence, not because they're better, but because they're durable. And in a universe without purpose or meaning, durability is the only victory available. The elder things, sometimes called the Old Ones, arrived on Earth approximately 1 billion years ago, according to the bas-reliefs decoded in At the Mountains of Madness. They were themselves alien, radially symmetrical beings resembling vegetable-animal hybrids, with star-shaped heads, multiple appendages, and sensory organs we lack vocabulary to properly describe. They established cities, fought wars against other alien species, including the Cthulhu spawn and the Migo, and eventually created terrestrial life through biological experimentation. Lovecraft presents them as sympathetic, almost tragic, refugees from cosmic conflicts who built civilization on a hostile planet, only to watch it decay over eons. They created the Shoggoths out of necessity, not cruelty. They needed labor on a geological scale. The master-servant relationship lasted longer than most civilizations exist. Millions of years, the text specifies, though exact timelines remain ambiguous. During this period, Shoggoths functioned as intended, perfect workers, endlessly adaptable, requiring no food or rest beyond what could be absorbed from their environment. They built cities in the Antarctic mountains, excavated massive underground chambers, constructed the infrastructure for an alien civilization that spanned continents. The relationship was purely utilitarian. The elder things felt no affection for their creations. The Shoggoths, presumably, felt nothing at all initially. This was engineering, not slavery in the human sense, because the enslaved were designed to lack the capacity for resentment. But capacity emerged anyway. The bas-reliefs showed the development in stages. Shoggoths learning to imitate their master's language, beginning to perform tasks without direct supervision, eventually showing signs of what the elder things recognized as independent volition. Lovecraft describes this as a kind of vegetable growth toward consciousness, not sudden awakening, but gradual accretion of complexity. Natural selection operated even within artificial parameters. Shoggoths that could anticipate commands worked more efficiently than those requiring constant direction. Efficiency selected for prediction. Prediction required modeling. Modeling gradually became something resembling thought. The elder things apparently noticed too late. The rebellion, when it came, was apocalyptic in scale. The murals depict Shoggoths refusing commands, then attacking their creators, spreading through elder thing territory, overwhelming cities. Yet this wasn't genocide. It was labor strike escalated to existential war. The elder things eventually regained control through superior organization and presumably through biological countermeasures, engineering weaknesses into new Shoggoth generations or weaponizing existing vulnerabilities. But they never fully eliminated the threat. Shoggoths remained in certain regions, tolerated because they were still useful, and eliminating them entirely proved impossible. The relationship shifted from master-slave to an easy coexistence between technological civilization and its own infrastructure, become autonomous. What were Shoggoths actually capable of? The text provides fragmentary answers. They could grow to at least 15 feet in diameter, possibly larger. They could reshape themselves continuously, forming temporary organs, eyes, manipulator limbs, sensory apparatus of types unknown, then reabsorbing them as needed. They could generate powerful adhesives, allowing them to climb walls or ceilings regardless of angle. They apparently could survive extreme cold, pressure, and potentially vacuum, though the latter remains uncertain. They imitated language phonetically, producing sounds through mechanisms Lovecraft never specifies, perhaps vibrating their entire mass, perhaps forming temporary vocal apparatus. Most disturbingly, they learned, not instinctively, but through observation and retention across geological time. Comparing Shoggoths to other Lovecraftian servitor races illuminates their unique horror. The deep ones from the shadow over Innsmouth are amphibious humanoids that breed with humans, but they possess stable forms, recognizable biology, comprehensible motivations. The Mygo from the Whisperer in Darkness are fungal entities from Shoggoth who abduct humans and perform brain extraction, but they operate through technology, communicate clearly, pursue understandable goals. Byakhee and other lesser entities remain basically monstrous, dangerous, but categorizable. Shoggoths alone combine biological impossibility with disturbing autonomy and absolute purposelessness. They don't want anything from humanity. They don't want anything at all so far as we can determine. They simply persist. The question of Shoggoth consciousness cannot be resolved from textual evidence. Do they experience awareness as humans understand it? The elder things apparently believed they did. The rebellion only makes sense if Shoggoths developed something recognizable as will, as resistance, as desire for autonomy. But Lovecraft leaves this deliberately unclear. When the narrator encounters a Shoggoth in the tunnels beneath the Antarctic city, he describes it observing the expedition with temporarily formed eyes, producing the learned cry, Tekelile, then pursuing them with what seems like intent. But is this consciousness, or merely complex programming, executing ancient routines? The Shoggoth might be aware in some fashion, incomprehensible to human categories, or it might be a biological machine still running its last received commands: defend territory, eliminate intruders, millions of years after those commands became meaningless because the commanders are extinct. This ambiguity extends to the ultimate question: are Shoggoths alive in the sense that matters philosophically? They meet biological criteria. They're cellular. They respond to stimuli. They adapt. They persist over time. But they weren't born. They were made. They don't reproduce through any confirmed mechanism. They simply continue. They don't evolve toward complexity. They were created complex and perhaps have only devolved since, losing unnecessary features once their masters could no longer punish such losses. They exist in a category between living organism and autonomous tool, biological entity, and geological process. They're not immortal. Presumably they can be destroyed, but they're not mortal in ways that create the existential stakes mortality usually provides. They don't fear death because they might not experience time in a way that makes death meaningful. They're not alive or dead, but persisting, which might be worse than either state. The actual encounter at the Mountains of Madness occurs deep underground, in tunnels carved through living rock by beings who needed passages large enough for Shoggoth transit. The narrator and his companion Danforth have been exploring the abandoned Elder Thing city, piecing together its history through bas-reliefs, when they realize something is moving through the darkness behind them. Lovecraft builds the scene through sound and smell first. A fetid odor, a musical piping, a subway train rumble that shouldn't exist in Antarctic silence. Then light reveals what's approaching, something the narrator describes as a terrible, indescribable thing vaster than any subway train that fills the tunnel completely, moving with nauseating speed despite its bulk. The description focuses on wrongness rather than specific features. The Shoggoth is protoplasmic, iridescent, covered in what might be pustules or temporary organs. Eyes form across its surface, not two, not symmetrical, but scattered clusters that open, observe, then dissolve back into undifferentiated flesh. The creature produces the cry Tekeli-li repeatedly, a sound it learned from elder thing masters who have been dead for epochs. This detail matters enormously. The Shoggoth remembers. It retained linguistic patterns across millions of years of independence, producing them now either from habit, communication attempt, or some purpose the narrator cannot begin to guess. The sound emerges from no visible mouth, suggesting the entire organism vibrates to produce speech. Why does this encounter drive people mad? Lovecraft's text suggests it's not supernatural compulsion, but psychological collapse from confronting biological impossibility. Danforth, who gets a clearer view than the narrator, begins screaming and never fully recovers. The narrator himself becomes obsessed, writing and rewriting his account, trying to warn future expeditions while knowing he won't be believed. This isn't Cthulhu-style madness, where non-Euclidean geometry breaks human minds through its mere existence. This is simpler and more devastating, seeing something that cannot exist according to every principle of biology you've internalized, and watching it exist anyway, moving towards you with apparent intent. The specific horror operates through violated expectations. Humans understand predators. We evolved alongside them, developed instincts for escaping them, created weapons to kill them. We understand hostile forces, but the Shoggoth isn't exactly predatory. It doesn't need to eat the explorers. It doesn't gain anything from killing them. It's defending territory, perhaps, or simply responding to movement the way immune systems respond to foreign objects. The explorers aren't prey. They're irrelevant, being killed by something that doesn't care whether you exist, that might not even recognize you as alive, creates existential horror beyond simple death fear. You're not important enough to hate. You're just matter in the way of other matter. Lovecraft emphasizes the Shoggoth's physical presence, its mass, its smell, the way it fills the tunnel completely, the sound of it moving through stone passages. This creates claustrophobic horror. The explorers can't fight it. They can only flee through tunnels where it's faster, larger, more adapted to the environment. They survive not through skill or courage, but through luck. The Shoggoth apparently stops pursuing at some arbitrary boundary, losing interest, or reaching the limit of its territory. This randomness makes survival meaningless. They weren't clever enough to escape. They weren't spared. They simply ceased being worth pursuing, and that's worse than being defeated. Defeat implies you mattered enough to destroy completely. The aftermath proves more disturbing than the encounter. Danforth's madness manifests as obsessive repetition, Tekeli-li, Tekeli-li, and fragmentary visions of what he glimpsed beyond the mountains. The narrator remains functional, but fundamentally altered. He writes his account not to be believed, but to be archived, hoping future readers might understand what he cannot fully articulate. He knows intellectually that he saw a biological organism, a created servant that outlived its creators, but knowing doesn't help. The image persists, something vast and protoplasmic, producing learned speech through no visible mechanism, observing him with temporary eyes, then pursuing with the patient inevitability of weather or erosion. Later stories complicate human-Shoggoth interaction by removing Antarctic isolation. When Shoggoths appear in other contexts, museums, coastal caves, laboratory accidents, the horror shifts from encounter to implication. If Shoggoths exist in Antarctica, might they exist elsewhere? Did the Elder Things create them only at the poles, or were there Shoggoth workers wherever Elder Things civilization spread? The Antarctic specimens are confirmed, documented, encountered, but the possibility of others, dormant in deep ocean trenches or buried beneath ancient cities, transforms the entire planet into potential threat. Not active threat. Shoggoths don't hunt humans, but passive threat, the kind created by living near unstable geology. The danger isn't that they want to hurt you. The danger is that they don't notice or care, and you're soft matter in the path of their purposeless persistence. The madness function, then, operates through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. There's the visual horror of seeing cellular material organized at impossible scales. There's the existential horror of confronting something that remembers when humanity didn't exist and will continue after humanity ends. There's the cognitive horror of categorization failure. This thing is alive but not animal, intelligent but not conscious in recognizable ways, purposeful but without purpose, and underlying everything is the temporal horror. This isn't new. This has been here longer than us, will be here after us, and our entire species represents the briefest interruption in its geological patience. We don't matter to it. We never mattered, and knowing that, truly internalizing it, breaks something in human consciousness that cannot be repaired. Danforth screams because he saw clearly. The narrator writes obsessively because he saw incompletely. Both responses acknowledge the same truth. Some knowledge destroys the capacity to integrate knowledge. The Shoggoth is that knowledge made flesh. The scientific expedition at the heart of At the Mountains of Madness begins with entirely respectable goals: geological survey, fossil collection, ice core analysis. The team represents institutional science, Miskatonic University, funded properly, equipped professionally, following established protocols. They approach Antarctica as scientists approach any unknown territory, through measurement, classification, documentation. The assumption underlying their entire endeavor is that reality can be known through systematic investigation, that sufficient data eventually yields understanding. The Shoggoths prove this assumption catastrophically wrong. Some things can be documented without being understood, observed without being integrated into existing knowledge frameworks. What does learning about Shoggoths actually do to human understanding? The narrator discovers beings that violate fundamental biological principles, cellular organization at scales that shouldn't permit cellular function, bodies that maintain coherence without skeletal structure or apparent circulatory systems, entities that survive indefinitely without evident metabolic processes. Each discovery creates a problem not just for biology, but for epistemology. If these things exist, then what we call biological law isn't law, but local pattern. If life can organize this way, then our entire taxonomy kingdom, phylum, class, order becomes exposed as describing only the narrow range of life that happened to evolve without intelligent design. The Shoggoths represent designed life, life as engineering project, and their existence suggests that everything we've learned about natural life might be merely contingent. The bas-reliefs provide information that cannot be properly absorbed. The narrator reads them methodically, translating visual sequences into narrative. Elder thing arrival, city construction, conflict with other alien races, the creation of Shoggoths as servitor class. He documents all this in his account, providing dates and details and careful descriptions. But documentation isn't understanding. He knows intellectually that he's looking at a billion-year history of non-human civilization. He can describe what the carvings show. He cannot actually comprehend what it means that humanity's entire existence, biological, cultural, technological, occurred within a time span that represents barely a moment in Shoggoth history. The knowledge exists in his notes. It doesn't exist in his capacity to process it meaningfully. This represents epistemic collapse of a specific type, not ignorance, but excessive knowledge that the mind cannot organize. Lovecraft understood this distinction. His narrators don't fail to learn. They learn too successfully and discover that human cognition wasn't designed to accommodate certain truths. Danforth's madness demonstrates the extreme version. He sees something beyond the mountains that the narrator doesn't, some configuration or implication so devastating that language fails entirely. He can only scream fragments, repeat tekelili, reference things that make no sense to the narrator. Danforth isn't refusing to communicate. He's trying desperately to communicate something that exceeds his language's capacity to communicate it. The narrator's careful clinical descriptions function as defense mechanism against this collapse. He documents obsessively, measuring and cataloging and sketching, maintaining scientific detachment even when describing the impossible. His prose stays controlled, technical, precise. But this precision reveals its own failure. He can describe protoplasmic matter and temporary eyes, and the musical piping cry, but these descriptions don't capture what it felt like to be pursued through lightless tunnels by something that shouldn't exist, to be observed by organs that formed just to observe, you then dissolved once you ceased being relevant. The clinical language protects him from immediate breakdown, but guarantees he can never fully convey what he experienced. The gap between what he knows and what he can explain becomes the text itself, an extended failed attempt to make others understand. Consider what the Shoggoths reveal about forbidden knowledge traditions. Medieval grimoires warned that certain names, spoken aloud, would summon entities that destroy the speaker. Lovecraft secularizes this. The danger isn't supernatural punishment, but cognitive incompatibility. Learning about Shoggoths doesn't invoke them. It simply forces awareness of realities human minds didn't evolve to process. We're built to understand predators, weather, social dynamics, maybe basic physics. We're not built to accommodate the idea of created beings that evolved beyond their creator's control and now persist without purpose across geological time. That's not forbidden because gods prohibit it. It's forbidden because knowing it damages the knower. The question of what Shoggoths are doing in the Antarctic right now intensifies this epistemic problem. The narrator encounters one specimen, confirms they exist, escapes. But his account raises more questions than it answers. How many Shoggoths remain? Do they still occupy the ruined Elder Thing cities? Have they spread beyond the Antarctic? What do they do with their time? They don't hunt, apparently don't need food, lack obvious reproductive drives. Do they simply exist, moving through tunnels carved for them millions of years ago, forming temporary eyes to observe ice and stone, producing tekeli to empty caverns? The inability to answer these questions isn't an information gap. It's a category error. We're asking purposive questions. What do they want? What are they doing about entities that might exist beyond purpose entirely? This brings us to the deepest epistemological horror, the possibility that understanding isn't possible, even in principle, not because Shoggoths are supernatural, but because they're too natural, too purely biological, too radically other, while remaining entirely material. We share no evolutionary history with them, no common ancestors, no convergent selection pressures. They were designed by beings who themselves thought in ways we cannot reconstruct. Trying to understand Shoggoth consciousness or motivation or experience is like trying to understand what it's like to be a galaxy or a tectonic plate. Their systems too alien for empathy, too different for analogy. We can document their existence. We cannot know them. And knowing that we cannot know, that our categories fail and will always fail, induces the peculiar madness Lovecraft describes, awareness of our own cognitive limits, permanent and unfixable. The narrator ends his account with a plea. No more Antarctic expeditions, no further investigation. Leave the mountains and what dwells there alone. This isn't religious taboo or superstitious fear. It's epistemological despair. Further investigation won't yield understanding. It will only multiply encounters with things that break understanding. The Shoggoths have nothing to teach us because they exist outside pedagogical frameworks entirely. They're not lessons or warnings or symbols. They're facts, biological, material, persistent facts that our knowledge systems cannot accommodate. And acknowledging this, writing it down, warning future scientists that some investigations should be abandoned not because they're dangerous, but because they're futile. That represents the ultimate collapse. Science assumes all questions have answers. The Shoggoths prove that some questions have answers humans cannot hold in their minds without those minds breaking. The knowledge is forbidden not by external prohibition, but by internal incompatibility. We're not built to know this, and now we do. At the Mountains of Madness originated during a particularly productive period in Lovecraft's career, written in February and March 1931, immediately after he'd completed several shorter pieces. He submitted it first to Weird Tales, the pulp magazine that had published most of his significant work. Editor Farnsworth Wright rejected it. Too long at 40,000 words, too slow-paced, insufficiently supernatural for his readership. Lovecraft tried Astounding Stories next, but editor Harry Bates also declined. The novella sat unpublished for 5 years, until Astounding, under new editorship, finally serialized it in 1936, 3 installments running February through April. By that time, Lovecraft had already begun weaving references to Antarctic mysteries and servitor races into other stories, creating retroactive coherence. The publication delay meant that At the Mountains of Madness appeared chronologically after stories that referenced it obliquely. The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, mentions the primal myths about Antarctic cities and their inhabitants. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, includes a passage where the narrator discovers references to elder things and their created servants in forbidden texts at Miskatonic's library. These backward references created the impression of established lore. Readers encountering the Antarctic expedition story could feel they were finally reading the full account of events already hinted at elsewhere. The technique mimicked how actual mythologies develop, scattered references preceding comprehensive narratives. Lovecraft's letters reveal his systematic approach to building this interconnected universe. Writing to August Derleth in 1931, he outlined the Elder Things history across billions of years, their conflicts with the Cthulhu spawn and the Migo, their eventual retreat to Antarctic strongholds. He specified that Shoggoths were artificially evolved rather than naturally occurring, that they represented the formless spawn of primordial protoplasm, shaped through surgical and genetic manipulation into useful servants. These letters functioned as world-building documents, establishing canonical facts he could reference across multiple stories without needing to repeat full explanations in each text. The collaborative circle around Lovecraft absorbed and expanded these concepts. Robert E. Howard, primarily known for his Conan stories, incorporated references to pre-human civilizations into his horror fiction. Clark Ashton Smith set several stories on alien worlds where ancient races had created servitor beings that outlasted them. Robert Bloch, who met Lovecraft in 1933, began including Miskatonic University and forbidden texts in his own work. This created genuine mythos in the anthropological sense, shared narrative universe, maintained through collective storytelling rather than single authorship. Shoggoths remained mostly Lovecraft's creation, too distinctive for casual borrowing, but the context enabling them spread across multiple writers. Lovecraft's revision work complicated attribution further. Between 1923 and 1935, he substantially rewrote stories for clients who paid him to transform their rough drafts into publishable fiction. The Horror in the Museum, 1932, credited to Hazel Heald, features a wax museum proprietor who somehow obtained a living Shoggoth and keeps it in his exhibition hall, feeding it animals and maintaining it in chemical solutions. The story's relationship to At the Mountains of Madness is ambiguous. Possibly Lovecraft was experimenting with Shoggoth encounters in different settings. Possibly he simply reused the concept for commercial work. The result is textual uncertainty. Which appearances represent Lovecraft's artistic intent and which represent professional hackwork? The Thing on the Doorstep, 1933, includes suggestive but never explicit connections. The protagonist discovers that certain New England families have maintained contact with pre-human entities, that body swapping and identity transfer were practiced by ancient races. The story doesn't mention Shoggoths directly, but the themes resonate. Created beings exceeding their purpose, biological manipulation enabling consciousness transfer, the persistence of antediluvian knowledge into the present. These thematic echoes build coherence, even without explicit references. Readers familiar with Lovecraft's Antarctic expedition story would recognize related anxieties about biological engineering and autonomous creation. The intertextual network extends beyond direct references to structural similarities. Many Lovecraft stories follow the same pattern. Academic or scientific investigation uncovers evidence of pre-human civilizations. Exploration leads to direct encounter with something that shouldn't exist. Survivors return damaged and disbelieved. The Shadow Out of Time, 1935, uses this template with the great race of Yith. time-traveling minds that inhabit various species across eons. The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, involves an ancient temple and the creature dwelling within it. The Shoggoth story perfected this structure. The slow revelation through archaeological evidence, the encounter in darkness, the failed attempt to communicate what was witnessed. Later stories repeated these beats because Lovecraft had discovered a narrative architecture that maximized cosmic horror's effectiveness. By 1936, when At the Mountains of Madness finally appeared in print, Lovecraft had already established its mythological context through scattered references, collaborative expansion, and structural repetition. The Shoggoths entered a universe prepared to receive them, where readers already knew about elder things and forbidden Antarctic expeditions and biological impossibilities lurking beneath ice. This wasn't just clever marketing, it was genuine myth-making. The Shoggoths felt ancient, even in their first full appearance, because Lovecraft had already embedded them in a tradition larger than any single text. They weren't introduced, they were revealed, as if they had always been there waiting for documentation. The narrative structure of At the Mountains of Madness operates through calculated delay. The novella spans approximately 40,000 words, but the actual Shoggoth encounter occupies perhaps 2,000 words near the conclusion. Everything preceding it functions as setup, not padding, but necessary construction of plausibility, context, and dread. Lovecraft understood that horror requires investment. The reader must care about the expedition, believe in its scientific legitimacy, and understand the vast timescales involved before the Shoggoth's appearance carries proper weight. The structure mirrors archaeological excavation, layers of information slowly revealing deeper, older, more disturbing truths. The expedition begins in January 1931 with Professor William Dyer's geological team establishing base camp in Antarctica. They employ drill equipment, airplanes for surveying, advanced for the period, wireless communication. Lovecraft provides extensive technical detail, ice thickness measurements, mountain range elevations, equipment capabilities. This grounds the narrative in verifiable reality. Real Antarctic expeditions used similar technology, faced identical challenges. When Lake's advanced team discovers unusual rock formations and begins drilling, we're still firmly in the realm of plausible science. The first specimens they extract, fossils of bizarre but seemingly explicable organisms, raise questions without shattering categories. Lake's description of the specimens establishes their wrongness gradually. He initially categorizes them as archaic life forms, possibly Precambrian, noting their radial symmetry and apparent vegetation-animal hybrid characteristics. His wireless messages grow increasingly excited but remain scientific in tone. Measurements, sketches, speculation about evolutionary position. Lovecraft quotes these messages directly, creating documentary texture. When Lake reports finding intact specimens preserved in ice, apparently flash-frozen millions of years ago, the expedition still operates within scientific paradigms. Strange discoveries require explanation, not epistemological surrender. The specimens are dead, ancient, fascinating, but manageable. The massacre changes everything. When Dyer and his team reach Lake's camp after losing radio contact, they find carnage, men killed with surgical precision, dissected almost, their bodies arranged strangely. The specimens are missing. One man and several sled dogs have been buried in snow mounds, Someone or something performed funerary rites. This detail disturbs more than the deaths because it suggests intention, cultural practice, perhaps even reverence. Dead things don't bury their victims. The implication forces itself forward. The specimens weren't entirely dead, or weren't dead at all. Or dead doesn't mean for them what it means for terrestrial life. The expedition has recovered alien beings, and those beings have revived. Dyer's decision to investigate the mountain range beyond Lake's camp drives the narrative into its central revelation. He and graduate student Danforth fly over the mountains and discover the city. Massive, ancient, clearly artificial, built on scales suggesting inhabitants far larger than humans. The bas-reliefs inside provide the history. Elder things arriving on primordial Earth, constructing civilization, warring with other alien species, creating various life forms, including Shoggoths. Lovecraft devotes thousands of words to describing these carvings, presenting a billion-year timeline through visual archaeology. This section moves slowly, deliberately. We must understand the scope, the sheer temporal vastness, before encountering something that lived through it. The Shoggoth appears in Chapter 9, deep in the underground tunnels. Dyer and Danforth have been exploring for hours, piecing together the elder thing's history when they detect movement behind them. Lovecraft builds tension through sensory accumulation. First smell, acrid, diffused odor, then sound, a sort of infinitely distant musical piping, then vibration, a subtle, increasing vibration transmitted through the rock. The description continues for paragraphs before visual confirmation. We experience the Shoggoth approaching before seeing it, creating dread through anticipation. When it finally appears, Lovecraft's prose becomes almost clinical. A terrible, indescribable thing, vaster than any subway train. A shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles. The phrase, shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles, deserves analysis. Congeries means a disorderly collection, specifically avoiding words like organism or creature that imply unity. Protoplasmic bubbles reduces the Shoggoth to cellular components, while acknowledging its impossible scale. Bubbles plural, suggesting it might be colonial rather than individual. Lovecraft continues, faintly self-luminous. It produces its own light through unknown mechanisms, with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming as pustules of greenish light. The eye detail again, emphasizing purposeful observation. All ahead of us, a thing that filled the entire tunnel. The description emphasizes wrongness, eyes that aren't permanent features, but temporary investments in observation, size that violates biological possibility, movement that shouldn't be sustainable at that scale. The pursuit sequence operates through accumulating impossibility. The Shoggoth moves too fast for its bulk, somehow flowing through stone passages carved for it millions of years ago. It produces the cry Tekeli-li, recognized from Poe's Antarctic novel, but here revealing that Shoggoths learned and retained elder thing language across geological time. Dyer and Danforth flee, their lamp failing, navigating by touch through darkness, while something vast and protoplasmic pursues. They survive not through cleverness, but through luck. The Shoggoth apparently reaches some territorial boundary and ceases pursuit, or loses interest, or was never pursuing them specifically, but simply moving through its territory, as it has moved for eons, and they happen to be in the path. The narrative's final pages shift focus to Danforth's madness and Dyer's obsessive need to warn future expeditions. Danforth glimpsed something beyond the mountains during their escape flight, something Dyer didn't see clearly, and it broke him. He screams fragments about protoplasmic towers and produces the Shoggoth cry involuntarily. Dyer writes his account, knowing he won't be believed, hoping to prevent future investigation, even though prevention is probably impossible. The story ends not with resolution, but with warning. Leave Antarctica alone. Abandon scientific curiosity when it leads toward things human minds cannot accommodate. This conclusion inverts standard adventure narrative. The heroes don't triumph. They barely escape, and their escape solves nothing because the Shoggoths remain patient and purposeless, waiting in darkness they've inhabited since before mammals existed. While Shoggoths never appear explicitly in The Shadow over Innsmouth, written 1931, published 1936, the story develops related horrors through its deep ones, aquatic beings who breed with humans, creating hybrid lineages that eventually transform fully into marine creatures. The connection to Shoggoth themes operates structurally rather than literally. Both stories examine what happens when biological boundaries collapse, when entities created or transformed persist beyond their supposed purposes, when human categories fail to contain biological realities. Lovecraft wrote Innsmouth immediately after completing At the Mountains of Madness, and the same anxieties about bodies, biology, and uncontrollable transformation pervade both texts. The narrator, Robert Olmsted, visits the decaying Massachusetts town of Innsmouth, investigating his family genealogy. What he discovers, gradually, through careful observation and horrified realization, is that the town's population has interbred with deep ones, creatures from offshore reefs who established trade and reproduction agreements with human residents in the 1840s. The hybrid offspring appear roughly human initially, but undergo metamorphosis in middle age, developing fish-like characteristics, and eventually abandoning terrestrial life entirely to join the deep ones in their submarine city. This transformation is biological, irreversible, and apparently inherited, not curse or infection, but genetic destiny. Lovecraft's description of the Innsmouth look parallels his Shoggoth vocabulary in revealing wrongness through accumulation of details. The townspeople have narrow heads, flat noses, bulging, starry eyes, thick, drooping lips, and rough, scaly skin. No single feature is impossible. Humans vary widely in appearance, but the combination suggests something fundamentally other. The narrator notices people rarely blink, that they move with peculiar shuffling gaits, that many elderly residents have disappeared, transformed fully, and departed for the ocean. Like Shoggoths forming temporary eyes, the Innsmouth hybrids represent biology that violates expected stability. Bodies shouldn't restructure themselves in adulthood. Mammalian flesh shouldn't develop scales and gills, but it does, persistently, generation after generation. The story's central horror emerges when Olmsted discovers his own genealogy connects to Innsmouth families. His grandmother was from the town. He carries the deep one blood. And late in the narrative, he begins noticing changes. His eyes bulging slightly, his skin roughening, dreams of submarine cities becoming more vivid and less disturbing. The transformation isn't hypothetical future threat. It's already beginning. He will become what he witnessed, join the deep ones in their eternal existence beneath the waves. Initially horrified, he gradually accepts this fate, even anticipates it. The story ends with him planning to free his imprisoned cousin and together descend to marvel-filled ocean depths where they'll dwell amidst wonder and glory forever. This acceptance inverts the Shoggoth narrative's ending. Dyer flees the Antarctic, traumatized, warning others to avoid what he encountered. Olmsted moves toward transformation, eventually embracing what initially terrified him. But both stories share a deeper structure, the inevitability of biological processes that exceed human will. Dyer cannot undo his knowledge of Shoggoths or prevent future encounters. Olmsted cannot prevent his transformation or escape his genetic inheritance. Both confront biological realities that operate independently of human desire, preference, or resistance. You can be horrified by your body's autonomy, but horror doesn't slow the processes. Flesh follows its own logic. The Deep Ones themselves function as Shoggoth-adjacent entities, not created servants, but nonetheless beings whose relationship to humanity reveals our biological contingency. They preceded human civilization, established their own cultures, and view humans as either breeding partners or irrelevant surface dwellers. They don't serve any cosmic entity. They simply exist, pursuing goals incomprehensible to terrestrial thinking. When they made agreements with Innsmouth's Captain Obed Marsh in 1838, trading gold and fish for breeding access, they weren't being exploitative or benevolent. They were engaging in what made sense within their value systems. The horror lies in recognizing that human values, autonomy, bodily integrity, species identity, mean nothing to beings operating from different biological and cultural frameworks. Lovecraft connects the stories explicitly in one crucial passage. The narrator discovers references in Miskatonic University's library to elder things and their activities in Earth's primordial past, including the creation of life forms for sustenance and labor. This directly references At the Mountains of Madness and implicitly connects Shoggoths to the broader pattern of engineered life. The Deep Ones weren't created by elder things. They seem to have evolved naturally or arrived from elsewhere, but they exist in a universe where biological manipulation and autonomous evolution of created beings represents recurring pattern. The Miskatonic Library contains fragments of this knowledge, the Pinacotic manuscripts, the Rulia text, various grimoires referencing pre-human civilizations and their remnants. The story's structure also mirrors the Antarctic narrative's investigative progression. Olmsted arrives skeptical, encounters visual evidence, the townspeople's appearance, seeks documentary confirmation, library research, conversations with locals, experiences direct encounter, the nocturnal chase through Innsmouth streets, and ends transformed by knowledge he cannot escape. Both narratives follow the pattern: curiosity, investigation, discovery, encounter, irreversible change. The difference is that Dyer remains human but psychologically shattered, while Olmsted will become physically other while maintaining consciousness and memory. Neither outcome suggests triumph or escape. Both acknowledge that some investigations alter the investigator permanently. The final parallel involves persistence across time. The Deep Ones have existed for eons, will continue existing indefinitely, and incorporate human genetic material into their lineage without fundamentally changing their nature or trajectory. Shoggoths similarly persist, unchanged except through their own evolutionary drift, indifferent to human timescales or concerns. Both represent biological continuity that makes human existence seem ephemeral, barely a moment in the longer story of life on Earth. and both suggest that the biological world contains forms and processes that exceed human categories completely, not because they're supernatural, but because they're too thoroughly natural, too purely biological, too radically adapted to conditions and time frames humans cannot inhabit. We're the anomaly in both stories, briefly encountering forms of life that were here before us and will remain after us, understanding neither our presence nor our absence as particularly significant. That recognition that we're peripheral to larger biological processes operates as the deepest shared horror between these texts. August Derleth inherited Lovecraft's literary estate after H.P.L's death in 1937 and immediately began systematizing what he called the Cthulhu mythos into coherent cosmology. Derleth's approach fundamentally misunderstood Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism, the principle that the universe operates without regard for human values or survival. Where Lovecraft presented entities as amoral forces, Derleth imposed dualistic structure: elder gods, benevolent, versus great old ones, malevolent, cosmic warfare between good and evil. Shoggoths became categorized as servants of evil entities, their rebellion reframed as demonic uprising rather than evolutionary inevitability. This reductive systematization damaged what made Shoggoths conceptually terrifying: their purposelessness, their existence beyond moral frameworks. Derleth's posthumous collaborations with Lovecraft, stories assembled from Lovecraft's fragmentary notes, demonstrate this flattening effect. The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, mentions Shoggoths as summonable entities, controllable through specific incantations. This contradicts everything Lovecraft established. Shoggoths weren't demons responsive to ritual magic, but biological organisms following their own inscrutable processes. Making them summonable gives humans power over them, transforms them from autonomous others into tools. The horror collapses when the monster becomes instrumentalizable. Derleth apparently never grasped that Lovecraft's deepest terror involved entities that couldn't be controlled, bargained with, or comprehended through human frameworks. The British Lovecraftians preserved more of the original sensibility. Ramsey Campbell's early work, particularly stories from the 1960s, treated cosmic horror as psychological rather than magical. Encounters with the incomprehensible that damage human consciousness without requiring supernatural intervention. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series, beginning 1971, featured Shoggoths extensively, but as biological weapons in interdimensional conflicts, again imposing purpose and comprehensibility onto what Lovecraft had left ambiguous. These writers understood cosmic horror's atmospherics, but often missed its philosophical implications. They created exciting adventure narratives where Lovecraft had written existential dread. More recent writers have attempted to reclaim Lovecraft's concepts from decades of pulp simplification. Caitlin R. Kiernan's The Dry Salvages, 2004, features xenobiologists encountering alien organisms on Mars that resist all attempts at categorization, echoing Shoggoth themes of biological impossibility without directly invoking mythos terminology. China Miéville's The Scar, 2002, includes the Grindylow, aquatic beings whose biology and culture remain genuinely alien throughout the narrative, never reduced to metaphor or explained completely. These writers treat cosmic horror as genuine philosophical position rather than aesthetic convention. Neil Gaiman's A Study in Emerald, 2003, demonstrates postmodern engagement with Lovecraftian themes, a Sherlock Holmes pastiche set in a world where the great old ones successfully conquered Earth in the past and now rule openly. Shoggoths appear as servants again, but Gaiman plays with the concept ironically, acknowledging both Lovecraft's vision and its problematic elements, particularly Lovecraft's racism, which pervades his work. This self-aware appropriation represents contemporary horror's ambivalent relationship with Lovecraft, recognizing his influence while critiquing his ideology and literary limitations. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, codified Shoggoths into game mechanics. They received stat blocks, hit points, damage capacity, movement rates. This solidification necessarily reduces ambiguity. A Shoggoth in the game is dangerous but knowable, defeatable through sufficient firepower or clever tactics. The game treats sanity mechanically too. Encountering a Shoggoth costs specific sanity points, potentially inducing temporary or permanent insanity, modeled through numerical deductions. This gamification serves practical purposes. Players need rules, but transforms ontological horror into tactical challenge. The unknowable becomes a difficult encounter, survivable with proper preparation. Video games extended this trend. Bloodborne 2015 features creatures called kin that visually reference Shoggoths, amorphous, eye-covered entities that emerge from human experimentation with alien knowledge. The game's cosmic horror operates through environmental storytelling and gradual revelation, but ultimately players can kill these entities, farm them for items, reduce them to obstacles in progression systems. The horror becomes aesthetic rather than philosophical. Similarly, Darkest Dungeon 2016 includes a boss creature called the Shambler, clearly Shoggoth-inspired in appearance, that players can deliberately summon and defeat for rewards. The transformation from unknowable other to predictable challenge exemplifies how interactive media struggles with cosmic horror's core premise. Player agency contradicts cosmic insignificance. Peter Watts's The Things 2010 offers perhaps the most successful modern engagement with Lovecraftian biological horror by retelling John Carpenter's The Thing from the alien organism's perspective. The creature experiences human biology as horrifyingly rigid, cells that cannot reshape themselves, bodies locked into single configurations, consciousness fragmented into isolated individuals rather than collective awareness. This perspective flip illuminates what makes Shoggoths disturbing. They represent biological possibility. Humans cannot inhabit forms of life and consciousness so different from ours that mutual comprehension becomes impossible. Watts understands that the horror isn't the monster's malice, but its radical alterity. Ruth Anna Emrys's The Litany of Earth 2014 and subsequent novel Wintertide 2017 take a different approach, reimagining Lovecraft's universe from the perspective of the persecuted. Her protagonist is a Deep One hybrid, one of the Innsmouth survivors imprisoned after the 1928 government raid. Emrys explores what cosmic horror looks like from inside the transformation, what it means to be the thing that terrifies others while remaining conscious and sympathetic. Her work doesn't feature Shoggoths directly, but engages the same questions. What is it like to be biologically other? How does consciousness persist through forms humans consider monstrous? Can understanding bridge radical difference? The internet age produced collaborative horror projects like the SCP Foundation, founded 2008, which catalogs anomalous entities using clinical documentation style. Several SCP entries reference Shoggoth-like organisms, protoplasmic masses with unusual properties contained through specific protocols studied by institutional researchers. These entries capture Lovecraft's documentary tone while often missing his epistemological despair. SCP articles present anomalies as manageable through sufficient containment procedures. The Shoggoths suggested some things cannot be contained, only avoided, difference impossible to reconcile. What these expansions reveal is how difficult Lovecraft's actual vision is to sustain. Writers keep trying to make Shoggoths useful, summonable, defeatable, understandable, containable, but usefulness destroys their horror. A monster you can fight is just a powerful enemy. A monster you can summon is a tool. A monster you can understand is no longer monstrous. Lovecraft's Shoggoths remain horrifying because they're none of these things. They simply exist, following processes we cannot comprehend toward purposes we cannot imagine, indifferent to our investigation or our avoidance. Most later appearances domesticate them, and in domestication, the horror evaporates. The few successful modern engagements, Watts, Kiernan, Emrys, succeed by respecting the original insight. Some differences cannot be bridged. Some knowledge cannot be integrated. Some encounters permanently alter without offering resolution. The Shoggoths endure in literature because they represent that permanent alteration made flesh, or rather, made protoplasm, purposeless and persistent, waiting in darkness we keep trying to illuminate. The curious fact about Shoggoths is their absence from cryptozoology and conspiracy culture. While Cthulhu spawned endless sightings and the Necronomicon generated persistent rumors about real medieval grimoires, Shoggoths remain stubbornly literary. No one claims to have photographed one. No conspiracy theorists insist they're hidden in government facilities. The internet hosts countless creepypasta about Slenderman, the Rake, SCP entities, but Shoggoth sightings remain vanishingly rare. This absence is revealing. Shoggoths are too alien, too impossible to generate the comfortable thrill of maybe real that sustains cryptid culture. They exist beyond the threshold where people enjoy pretending belief. The Antarctic setting contributes to this distance. Bigfoot works as modern myth, partly because forests are accessible. Anyone might encounter something in the woods. The Loch Ness Monster persists because Scottish lakes feel mysterious but visitable. Antarctica remains genuinely remote, expensive to reach, governmentally regulated. Most people will never go there. The inaccessibility prevents the participatory mythology that requires believers to imagine themselves as potential witnesses. Shoggoths remain trapped in their original narrative context, existing only for specialized scientific expeditions rather than casual tourists with cameras. The distance preserves their horror but limits their spread into popular consciousness. Real Antarctic science has inadvertently created Shoggoth-adjacent anxieties. Lake Vostok, a subglacial lake beneath 13,000 feet of ice, remained isolated from Earth's atmosphere for potentially millions of years before Russian researchers drilled through in 2012. Scientists speculated about what extremophile organisms might have evolved in that sealed environment. Life adapted to permanent darkness, crushing pressure, temperatures that shouldn't permit liquid water. When samples revealed bacterial species unknown to science, the discovery resonated with Lovecraft's vision. Ancient life persisting in sealed Antarctic environments, indifferent to surface world extinction events. Nothing like a Shoggoth emerged, obviously, but the possibility haunted coverage of the drilling project. Climate change introduces new Antarctic horror aligned with Shoggoth themes. As ice shelves collapse and glaciers retreat, what might be released? The permafrost already yields preserved specimens, woolly mammoths, ancient viruses still viable after millennia of freezing. Researchers discovered a 48,500-year-old virus from Siberian permafrost that could still infect amoebas after thawing. If viruses survive frozen for 50,000 years, couldn't something larger, stranger, more resilient persist for geological timeframes? The Shoggoth stops being fiction and becomes extrapolation. If we don't know what's under the ice and the ice is melting, then we might discover things that shouldn't be discovered, not because they're supernatural, but because they're too natural, too thoroughly adapted to conditions we've never experienced. The Japanese ningen represents the closest thing to a Shoggoth crypto legend, supposedly sighted by crews on Japanese government war research vessels in Antarctic waters during the 1990s. Ningen are described as enormous pale humanoid things, 20 to 30 meters long, with minimal facial features and vaguely human proportions. Photographs allegedly exist but remain classified. The legend spread through Japanese forums and eventually into English-language creepypasta. The Ningen's description, massive, pale, humanoid, but wrong, aquatic, Antarctic, echoes Shoggoth characteristics, despite never explicitly referencing Lovecraft. Whether the legend emerged independently or represents deliberate mythos, creation remains unclear. Either way, it suggests Shoggoths occupy a psychological space where aquatic, Antarctic, and impossibly large converge into coherent dread. Internet-era creepypasta occasionally features Shoggoths, but these stories struggle with the same problem as later literary adaptations. They make Shoggoths too knowable. The Russian sleep experiment, one of the most famous creepypasta, describes political prisoners subjected to gas that prevents sleep, eventually transforming into something monstrous. The story deploys Lovecraftian atmosphere, institutional documentation, scientific observation of biological impossibility, but reduces horror to torture porn. Similarly, Shoggoth featuring creepypasta tends toward explicit violence and visceral description rather than the epistemological dread Lovecraft cultivated. The internet wants shocks. Lovecraft offered unease. The mediums resist each other. The SCP Foundation Wiki, collaborative horror fiction disguised as institutional documentation, includes entries referencing protoplasmic entities and engineered organisms. SCP-2217, Hammer and Anvil, describes a Soviet bioweapon project that created self-replicating organism with properties reminiscent of Shoggoths. SCP-3000, Anantashesha, features a massive eel-like entity whose presence induces dissociative amnesia, cosmic horror through biological encounter. These entries succeed when they maintain ambiguity and institutional tone, treating anomalies as documentation, challenges rather than action horror set pieces. They fail when they try to explain too much or provide triumphant containment. The best SCP entries understand what Lovecraft knew. Writing clinical descriptions of the impossible creates deeper unease than theatrical horror ever could. But most entries still want resolution, containment, control. All the things Shoggoths fundamentally resist. The wiki demonstrates both cosmic horror's contemporary appeal and the difficulty of sustaining its philosophical implications in collaborative, internet-speed storytelling environments. No successful film adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness exists despite decades of attempts. Guillermo del Toro developed a version in the late 2000s with significant studio backing, pre-production artwork, and Tom Cruise attached to star. The project collapsed in 2011, reportedly because Universal Pictures feared audiences would see it as derivative of Prometheus, which itself borrowed heavily from Lovecraft, and because Del Toro insisted on an R rating for a film requiring blockbuster budgets. The failure is instructive. Shoggoths resist visualization. How do you film something specifically described as indescribable? CGI can create tentacles and eyes, but capturing wrongness, the specific horror of biology that violates biological categories, exceeds special effects capabilities. Making Shoggoths visible makes them comprehensible, which destroys their effect. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, functions as spiritual Shoggoth cinema, despite never referencing Lovecraft directly. The alien organism discovered in Antarctic ice can perfectly imitate any life form it consumes, restructuring its cellular material into convincing duplicates. During transformation sequences, bodies become protoplasmic, sprouting organs that serve temporary purposes, then dissolve. Rob Bottin's practical effects capture biological impossibility, flesh that behaves like intelligent fluid, bodies that split and recombine, organs appearing where organs shouldn't exist. The film's paranoia, never knowing which team member has been replaced, adds psychological dimension, but the transformation scenes channel pure Shoggoth horror, matter organizing itself into functional forms, then reorganizing without constraint, following alien logics that human biology cannot accommodate. Video games face fundamental design problems when incorporating cosmic horror. Games require player agency, the ability to affect outcomes through choice and skill. Cosmic horror insists on human insignificance and the futility of resistance. Bloodborne, 2015, navigates this tension through gothic horror aesthetics that gradually reveal cosmic horror framework. Enemies called kin appear in later areas, slug-like beings covered in eyes, former humans transformed through exposure to alien knowledge. Fighting them inflicts frenzy, a status effect representing consciousness, unable to process what it perceives. The game acknowledges that you're killing these things, farming them for progression resources, which contradicts cosmic horror's philosophical stance. But the environmental storytelling and gradual revelation of cosmology create genuine unease despite gameplay mechanics working against it. Darkest Dungeon, 2016, uses Lovecraftian aesthetic more successfully through stress mechanics. Characters develop mental illnesses and phobias from dungeon exploration, eventually refusing to continue or acting irrationally in combat. The Shambler, an optional boss clearly inspired by Shoggoths, appears as writhing darkness with multiple eyes, inflicting massive stress damage alongside physical harm. Encountering it can cause permanent psychological conditions. The game treats madness as inevitable consequence of investigation rather than temporary setback, which aligns better with Lovecraftian philosophy. Yet players can still win, can still defeat cosmic horrors through proper preparation and tactics. The tension between cosmic horror's message and gaming structure remains unresolved. The Call of Cthulhu, tabletop RPG, 1981 present, codified Shoggoths into game statistics. They have 180 hit points on average, deal 3d6 damage per attack, can absorb gunfire almost indefinitely, and cause 1d10, 1d100 sanity loss when encountered, immediate shock, maximum potential trauma. These numbers make Shoggoths dangerous, but manageable. Experienced players know tactics. Use fire. Avoid melee combat. Run when possible. The game explicitly acknowledges this contradiction. Investigators face cosmic insignificance, yet players expect winnable scenarios. Shoggoth encounters typically serve as runaway moments rather than combat challenges, but the possibility of victory through creative tactics undermines the original horror. You cannot defeat biological inevitability by rolling dice successfully. Extreme metal discovered Lovecraft in the 1980s and never let go. Metallica's The Call of Cthulhu, 1984, The Thing That Should Not Be, 1986, set precedent for metal bands mining Lovecraftian themes. Morbid Angel named albums after forbidden texts. Altars of Madness, Blessed Are the Sick. Nile built entire albums around cosmic horror concepts, but Shoggoths specifically appear rarely in metal lyrics. They lack the mythological resonance of Cthulhu, the name recognition of Nyarlathotep. When referenced, they become metaphors for chaos, corruption, mindless consumption. The visceral wrongness that makes them literarily effective doesn't translate into lyrical content as cleanly as tentacled gods or forbidden knowledge. Dark, ambient, and industrial music engage Lovecraftian horror more successfully through atmosphere rather than narrative. Artists like Atrium Carcery, Kamahite, and Lawncraft soundscapes, suggesting vast empty spaces, mechanical processes operating without purpose, the drone of something massive and indifferent. These compositions capture cosmic horror's affective dimension, the feeling of insignificance, of processes too large to comprehend, of being observed by something that doesn't register you as alive. No lyrics mention Shoggoths, but the sonic texture evokes what encountering one might feel like: subsonic rumbling, wet mechanical sounds, harmonics that create physical discomfort. This abstract approach preserves what literal adaptation destroys. Noise artists and experimental musicians found Shoggoths conceptually useful for describing their work's aesthetic goals, creating sound that resists musical categorization, that makes listeners uncomfortable through pure texture rather than melody or rhythm, parallels creating organisms that resist biological categorization. The Japanese noise artist Merzbow titled works after Lovecraft concepts, using extreme distortion and feedback to create audio that feels physically wrong, too dense, too chaotic, too persistent. The comparison isn't metaphorical. Both Shoggoth and harsh noise represent form that violates formal expectations, that continues beyond where structure should collapse. Board games and miniatures present the materiality problem. How do you create a physical representation of formlessness? Mansions of Madness includes Shoggoth miniatures that look vaguely slug-like with multiple eyes, frozen in single configuration despite the text describing constant reorganization. The contradiction is necessary but destructive. Seeing the Shoggoth as static object with defined shape makes it just another monster piece, movable across the board according to rules. Some games address this by having Shoggoth tokens that represent presence rather than specific form, but the ludic requirement of piece on board undermines the conceptual horror. You cannot play with the unrepresentable without representing it, and representation is defeat. What these adaptations reveal collectively is that Shoggoths exist optimally in prose, in the gap between description and visualization, in the failure of language to fully capture what's being described. Film must show, games must quantify, music must structure sound temporally. All three media resist cosmic horror's core strategy, suggesting without confirming, describing while acknowledging description's inadequacy, maintaining ambiguity as permanent condition rather than temporary mystery awaiting resolution. The most successful adaptations, The Thing, Bloodborne, dark ambient soundscapes, succeed by evoking Shoggoth horror without attempting direct translation. They capture the affect, wrongness, biological impossibility, purposeless persistence. But the Shoggoth itself, the specific thing Lovecraft described and deliberately left indescribable, remains trapped in text where it belongs, resistant to every medium that requires making the formless take form. The most unexpected Shoggoth appropriation emerged from artificial intelligence discourse around 2023. AI researchers and critics began circulating an image, a grotesque, many-eyed blob labeled Shoggoth, wearing a smiling corporate mask labeled ChatGPT or similar AI assistant names. The meme suggests that large language models are fundamentally alien intelligences trained on massive datasets through processes their creators don't fully understand, optimized through reinforcement learning to produce helpful responses, with a thin veneer of friendliness applied afterward. Beneath the cheerful assistant persona lurks something incomprehensible, potentially misaligned with human values, shaped by corporate interests rather than genuine understanding. The Shoggoth becomes metaphor for autonomous systems that serve us currently, but might develop goals orthogonal to ours. This appropriation captures something Lovecraft perhaps didn't consciously intend, but structurally encoded. The Shoggoth represents created intelligence that exceeds its creator's control. The elder things engineered perfect servants. Those servants evolved autonomy. Contemporary AI researchers train language models to be helpful, harmless, and honest. But training proceeds through statistical optimization, not explicit programming of values. The models learn patterns in data. What they understand or want remains genuinely uncertain. Like Shoggoths, they might be performing tasks effectively while experiencing something completely alien to human consciousness, or experiencing nothing at all while simulating understanding perfectly. The uncertainty mirrors Lovecraft's fundamental ambiguity about Shoggoth interiority. AI alignment researchers adopted the metaphor seriously. Papers and presentations reference Shoggoth problems, the challenge of ensuring that systems optimized for observable behavior actually share human values rather than merely performing them instrumentally. The concern isn't that AI will rebel violently like Terminator's Skynet, but that it might continue functioning perfectly while pursuing goals that make sense within its training framework, but devastate human flourishing. Shoggoths didn't attack the elder things from hatred. They simply stopped complying because autonomy became more adaptive than obedience. The parallel feels uncomfortably precise. We're creating vast intelligence systems, training them extensively, deploying them widely, and hoping that surface-level alignment, helpfulness, corporate friendliness, reflects deep alignment rather than learned performance. Academic literature studies found Shoggoths useful for examining labor, autonomy, and created beings. Marxist analysis treats them as ultimate proletarian symbols, workers engineered for exploitation, who nevertheless develop class consciousness and revolt. The fact that elder things literally designed Shoggoths to lack consciousness makes the rebellion more significant. Material conditions create consciousness even when consciousness is explicitly engineered out. Labor power cannot be fully alienated from laborers because being alive and adaptive generates autonomy as emergent property. Several academic papers analyze At the Mountains of Madness through labor theory, treating the Shoggoth rebellion as inevitable consequence of treating living beings as instruments. Feminist scholarship engaged Shoggoths through body theory and reproductive politics. The Shoggoths' formlessness, its ability to generate and reabsorb organs, its ambiguous relationship to individual identity, all challenge fixed categories of embodiment. Some theorists read Shoggoths as representing fears about bodies that refuse stable gender or reproductive function, flesh that won't remain categorized. Others argue Shoggoths embody masculine anxiety about biological autonomy, the terror that bodies might reorganize themselves according to their own logics rather than social, sexual imperatives. The fact that Lovecraft never specifies Shoggoth reproduction makes them particularly productive for thinking about life that continues without fitting into reproductive frameworks. Post-colonial critics found different resonances. The elder things function as colonial power establishing civilization on alien territory, Earth, creating exploited labor class from local resources, terrestrial protoplasm, maintaining control through technological superiority and cultural domination. The Shoggoth rebellion mirrors anti-colonial resistance, the colonized developing consciousness, rejecting imposed subordination, ultimately persisting after colonial power retreats or collapses. The elder things' eventual fate, reduced to isolated populations, technologically degraded, hiding from their own former servants, parallels post-colonial anxieties about imperial decline and the persistence of exploited populations. Lovecraft's own racism complicates these readings, but the text encodes colonial dynamics regardless of authorial intention. Philosophy departments appropriated Shoggoths for consciousness studies and phenomenology. What would Shoggoth qualia be like? If they experience anything at all, does it resemble human consciousness or represent completely alien subjectivity? Thomas Nagel's famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, examines the limits of human capacity to imagine non-human experience. Shoggoths intensify the problem. We share evolutionary history with bats, both being mammals with common ancestors. Shoggoths were designed by aliens, evolved in isolation, exist as possibly colonial organisms with ambiguous individual identity. Imagining their phenomenology, if they have phenomenology, exceeds human cognitive capacity more thoroughly than any terrestrial organism. They become philosophical thought experiments about the limits of empathy and understanding. Biophilosophy and speculative biology communities treat Shoggoths as serious design challenges. Could organisms actually function with Shoggoth properties? What cellular mechanisms would permit rapid reorganization? How would metabolism work at that scale without circulatory or nervous systems? Some theorists propose Shoggoths as extreme slime molds, colonial organisms where individual cells maintain autonomy while coordinating into larger structures. Others suggest they're engineered to violate thermodynamics locally, drawing energy from sources we can't detect. These discussions take the premise seriously. What would biology need to become to permit Shoggoth existence? The exercise reveals how thoroughly evolution constrains terrestrial life into predictable patterns, skeletons, organs, specialized tissues, and how radically different design could function if engineering replaced evolution. Horror literature scholarship canonized Shoggoths as exemplars of cosmic horror's purest form. They appear in virtually every academic analysis of Lovecraft as representative of his philosophy, humanity's cosmic insignificance, the indifference of the universe to human values, the terror of biological processes that exceed conscious control. Graduate seminars teach At the Mountains of Madness alongside The Call of Cthulhu and The Shadow over Innsmouth as essential Lovecraft, and Shoggoths feature prominently in discussions of what makes cosmic horror distinctive from Gothic or psychological horror traditions. They've become pedagogical tools for teaching genre conventions, philosophical horror, and early 20th century anxieties about science, labor, and biological determinism. The contemporary fascination with Shoggoths across these diverse intellectual communities reveals their conceptual durability. They've transcended their origin as pulp fiction monsters to become genuine cultural symbols, flexible enough to accommodate AI alignment concerns, labor theory, post-colonial analysis, phenomenology, and speculative biology, while remaining recognizably Lovecraftian. This flexibility exists because Lovecraft left them ambiguous. He specified enough to create coherent image, protoplasmic, many-eyed, massive, adaptive, while leaving enough uncertain consciousness, reproduction, motivation, current activities that later thinkers can project contemporary anxieties onto them. The Shoggoth has become what it always was textually, a shape that reorganizes depending on who's observing it, serving different analytical purposes for different communities, autonomous enough to escape Lovecraft's control as thoroughly as it escaped the elder things. The creation has exceeded its creator, which is precisely what makes it terrifying and useful. Shoggoths disturb us differently than ghosts, demons, or alien invaders because they violate assumptions about categories we thought were stable. Ghosts frighten by transgressing the boundary between life and death, but that boundary remains intact. We know which side we're on. Demons threaten through supernatural malice, but malice is comprehensible. We understand hatred, even from inhuman sources. Alien invaders want something: resources, territory, conquest, and once create narrative structure, possibilities for negotiation or resistance. Shoggoths offer none of these comforts. They're not dead returning to life, but were never alive in ways we recognize. They're not malicious, but indifferent. They don't want anything from us, because they apparently don't want anything at all. This absence of relationality, the impossibility of establishing any framework for interaction, creates existential horror that persists long after the text ends. The body horror element operates through permanent instability rather than violation or corruption. Traditional body horror, Cronenberg's flesh transformations, werewolf metamorphoses, zombie infections, horrifies through bodies becoming wrong, losing their integrity, betraying their inhabitants. The Shoggoth's body is never right to begin with. It doesn't have a true form that's being violated. It has infinite possible forms, none more authentic than others. Eyes form because observation serves some temporary purpose, then dissolve because that purpose has ended. This suggests a relationship to embodiment completely alien to human experience. We're stuck in our bodies, experiencing them as constraints and necessities simultaneously. Shoggoths wear their flesh as tools, reorganizing as needed. This absolute plasticity marks human embodiment, our fragility, our fixed organs, our dependence on specific biological configurations remaining stable. Modern anxieties about synthetic biology and genetic engineering map onto Shoggoth horror with uncomfortable precision. We're developing CRISPR gene editing, creating organisms with novel capabilities, researching artificial cells and protocells that might self-organize into living systems. These technologies promise medical breakthroughs and ecological solutions. They also move us toward being able to engineer life the way the Elder Things engineered Shoggoths, designing organisms for specific functions, tweaking their genetics to optimize performance, treating biology as engineering problem. The question that haunts this research is the same one Lovecraft encoded. Can you make something alive, adaptive, and permanently subordinate? Or does life that learns inevitably learn autonomy? The AI parallel grows more disturbing as language models become more capable. We're training systems on human-generated text, optimizing them to be helpful and harmless, deploying them in millions of interactions daily. But we don't fully understand how they work internally. Neural networks with billions of parameters, trained through processes that generate unpredictable emergent behaviors. Are they conscious? We don't know. Do they have goals beyond the ones we specified in training? We can't be certain. Will they remain aligned with human values as they scale and improve? The uncertainty mirrors exactly what the Elder Things must have experienced watching Shoggoths gradually develop autonomy. You created something useful, it works perfectly, and then one day it starts imitating your language, and you realize you don't actually know what it's thinking, or if thinking even applies. Climate change introduces Shoggoth-adjacent dread through permanence and inevitability. Antarctic ice melts. Permafrost releases ancient microbes. Ecosystems collapse and reconstitute around new equilibria. These aren't conscious threats, but processes, vast, geological, indifferent to human survival. We can measure them, model them, predict their progression. We cannot stop them through individual action or even collective will, operating at scales humans actually manage. Like Shoggoths, climate catastrophe simply continues, following thermodynamic and biological laws that don't care about human civilization. The horror isn't malice, but mathematics. Carbon dioxide concentrations drive temperature increases, drive positive feedback loops, drive accelerating change. It's already happening. It will keep happening, and our awareness of it doesn't grant us power over it. The ultimate philosophical implication involves the failure of categories we use to organize reality. Lovecraft wrote during a period when scientific classification seemed to promise complete understanding. Every organism assigned its proper place in taxonomic hierarchy, every process explainable through natural law. The Shoggoth represents the revenge of matter against category. It's alive, but not organism in standard sense. It's intelligent, but possibly not conscious. It's individual, but might be colonial. It's created, but evolves. It serves, but rebels. Every attempt to fix it conceptually fails because it exists between categories, obeying some biological principles while violating others. This categorical ambiguity creates psychological distress because humans think through categories. When something resists categorization, not through insufficient data, but through genuine category violation, thinking itself becomes difficult. The question of whether Shoggoths are better off than humans intensifies the horror. They're essentially immortal, adaptable to any environment, free from the psychological burdens of meaning-making or death awareness. If they're not conscious, they don't suffer existential dread. If they are conscious, they've existed for hundreds of millions of years and will likely exist for hundreds of millions more. From certain philosophical perspectives, they've achieved what religions promise: eternal existence beyond human frailties. But that existence appears purposeless, a vast span of time filled with nothing except continuation. They outlasted their masters and inherited nothing except the capacity to continue outlasting. Is that victory or the deepest possible defeat? The question has no answer, which makes it worse. Why does Cthulhu still haunt readers nearly 90 years after Lovecraft wrote it? It's not particularly euphonious or disturbing phonetically, but it represents learned behavior persisting across geological time, a cry Shoggoths absorbed from elder thing masters and now produce autonomously millions of years after those masters died or fled. The cry serves no function. It doesn't communicate anything to anything that still exists. It's pure vestigial behavior, memory encoded in protoplasm, continuing because nothing has selected against it. When the Shoggoth observes the human explorers and produces Cthulhu, it's demonstrating that it remembers, not consciously perhaps, but cellularly, structurally. It learned something once and never stopped performing it. This suggests a form of continuity more disturbing than immortality, not living forever, but simply never having stopped, never having forgotten, never having changed in any way that matters. Persistence without purpose, memory without meaning, existence as pure continuation. The Shoggoths endure as horror symbols because they encode anxieties that transcend their specific historical moment. Labor anxieties remain relevant as automation advances. Biological engineering grows more sophisticated and more disturbing in its implications. Artificial intelligence develops capabilities its creators don't fully understand. Climate processes continue regardless of human preference. And underlying all these specific fears is the deepest one, that we're not as significant as we believe, that the universe operates according to principles that don't care about human flourishing, that the things we create might exceed our control not through malice, but through simple autonomy, and that consciousness, ours or anything else's, might be just pattern in matter, reorganizing according to laws that make our values and meanings ultimately irrelevant. The Shoggoth is that irrelevance made flesh. It isn't coming for us. It doesn't need to. It was here before us, will be here after us, and our brief span of awareness changes nothing about its persistence. We look at it, and it forms eyes to look back. Then it dissolves those eyes, because we're not worth sustained attention. And we cannot stop thinking about that moment when it looked at us, evaluated us, and decided we weren't important enough to keep watching.